Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I am Ryan John Murphy, former Microsoft MVP and compliance consultant at Microsoft. And as always, I'm joined by Nikki. Hey, Nikki.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, everyone. My name's Nikki Chappell. I'm the Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway, and I'm also a dual MVP, both in Microsoft 365 and also security. And today, I'd like to welcome you to Bram, who's going to join us as a guest on the podcast and talk about data protection. Welcome, Bram.
Thank you. Yes, good morning, good day. My name is Bram Jager. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm also an MVP, also in two areas, actually, what I just noticed, Nikki, same M365 and the security area. Been an MVP for 6 years right now, and working in the Netherlands with a lot of customers at Device Matters, my own company, and very active in the community, running 2 user groups at this point. So keeping busy, let's put it that way. I'm very happy to be on the show.
Thank you very much for joining us today. So we're going to talk about a subject today, I think, that's going to be close to everybody's heart. We've got to talk about Copilot. Everyone's heard about that now. So, Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365. And it's all of those risks about, this clever Gen AI. What information is it going to return from SharePoint and OneDrive? What data is at risk, and what are those? What things can we do to protect it? So, Bram, what have you seen with the customers that you work with?
From the good side or from the bad side? Because it's probably getting interesting on both ends. But let's start with the positive things here. I think it adds a lot of value. I think Copilot is definitely one, but taking it from a broader approach, the generative AI engines which are out there, they are being used, and I think they're being used even more and more nowadays. Simple cases, as in I'm just looking for some information, and I can either choose to use, let's stick to SharePoint and the SharePoint search, of course, which is there, which works great from the perspective. But now with Copilot nowadays makes it just a bit sometimes easier. You need less words or less specific words to kind of direct the search engine, and Copilot just pops it out and allows you to kind of have follow-up questions or follow-up directives to get to the eventual content which you're looking for. So that's the simple cases, and then going all the way to building extension, or at least companies are trying out the extension. I think that's probably the best wording at this point, to see how do you get more specific bits and pieces into Copilot, allowing you to ask questions. I think there's a lot to it which is being used, but a lot of people are just probably the wrong wording, but a lot of people are using the M365 Copilot, so that adds a lot of value. And I'm using it myself as well, just to get up to speed when I'm at a customer and I've been out for a couple of days, and so getting the latest information, who should I talk to, things like that, what are the most important bits and pieces in my email. And also the parts where I haven't attended meetings, which is really interesting, I think, especially the more larger meetings for an apartment or the town hall meetings, which have recordings. It just allows me to get within 5 minutes summary of what are the key points to the meeting, instead of watching 1.5 hours the meeting itself, basically. So that helps a lot. And I'm actually surprised how well the information comes out of it, because I'm validating the information then with people around me, saying, hey, last week there was a meeting. I thought these are the topics which are being discussed. I think these are the outcomes. Is that correct? And that allows me to have then a conversation with them without actually, viewing the recording. I should probably say that, because maybe that's not too good for me, but it does help that way. Yeah.
So what about kind of some of the kind of data security risks? Are you finding that organizations are coming to you and are concerned about that risk of oversharing their data?
Yeah, that's the other part which I was mentioning. So more of the less nice part of maybe Copilot from that perspective. And it's actually, to be honest, it's not Copilot. It's going back to the Gen AI engines which are there. So a lot of companies want to jump on the bandwagon and basically start using the Copilot or the Gen AI engines. And at first, they just figure it out, or people are just trying it, and that kind of gets to the point where eventually there's going to be a bit of worries, as in I'm going to share information to the engines, and that means I'm going to share that information out to somewhere else instead of our own environments, let's put it that way. and what is happening with that particular data. So that's where it gets interesting. Well, everybody probably knows already there's a couple of events happened where information got out in the world which shouldn't be there, basically. Luckily, my customers haven't, well, at least they are not aware that that happened so far, because maybe that did happen, but you don't always know, of course. So that's a bit where the worries basically get in, and people start to, because it's not always technical solutions which kind of cover that angle. There's a bit of technical solutions which cover it, but it's also about user education, adoption, awareness, that making people aware that once you put something into the engine, whether it's Copilot or a different one, it doesn't matter, but that data is being sent to the servers of the vendor who's behind it, basically, and that information might be sent to public large language models as well. And so that might come out somewhere else, basically, where you don't want it to come out.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting there, Bram. And I think I'm not alone when I say this. It comes up all of the time, is the fact that customers will say M365 Copilot is great. It really is great. It really gives us that great summarization on all the elements that we need on from meetings and calls, town halls, and all the rest of it. But it provides us a risk. So I asked what the risk is, and the risk that they tell me is the fact that it basically exposes all of the bad sharing policies in their environment. So from a SharePoint side perspective, who has access, whether it's hot sharing, cold sharing, and all of the above. Okay. And my reply is always, well, that risk has always been there. Copilot has just highlighted that risk for you. What a lot of customers don't know is, on Microsoft GitHub, there's actually a number of PowerShell scripts that you can go and get and you can use to help with that scenario. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't tell you, this hasn't been accessed for this many days or whatever the case may be. It just essentially goes through and shows you that in a visualization of, here's all the shared items in your environment. You might want to take a look at these because they've got an anyone sharing policy assigned to them. I'll see a lot of people fall down with that, and they'll basically turn around to the CISO, CDO and say, it's great, but it's such a risk to deploy. Well, we do have tools, and those risks have always been there. It's down to you as an organization to try and rectify them. Have you heard this, Nikki, Bram?
I have, yeah. It's kind of, I think it's that fear of the unknown, isn't it? And I know Microsoft published some statistics that are saying that 75% of the people have already used some form of Gen AI. So if your company is not providing Copilot for Microsoft 365, well, you know that your data is being kept safe. If you're using the public ones, then you don't, as you mentioned earlier, Bram, you don't know what's happening. Once you've pasted your data in that third-party service, what is it going to do? Is it going to use your data to learn with the model? Is it going to do other things with it? And I think this is probably one of the first times in a long, long time that it's the business that are driving IT technology. Normally, it's us technologists having to say, like, we've implemented email. You've got to move from paper to email. And then Teams, Microsoft Teams, there's still so many people that are wedded still in email. They haven't even got onto the Teams adoption. But now it's the business lead in IT. It's the other way around. And if the CISOs are saying, I don't know what's in my data, it's all unstructured. How do I know what's there? I'm going to switch it off. Well, people will find another way. It's back to that shadow IT.
Indeed.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting from the perspective, because the amount of Gen AI engine is kind of growing rapidly. So shutting down one is not resolving the issue. It's basically, you can't really shut down one. And well, secondly, the question is, how are you going to shut it down? Because eventually there are always ways around it. So that also goes back to, technology is not only solving one thing, it's also about the user adoption, making people aware that they shouldn't be using the Gen AI engines with particular data. They can use it, but be aware what you put into the engine instead of just putting everything in there. Going back to that one. And the other one, which is interesting, Ryan, what you just mentioned, going back to that one, is kind of that topic on how much is visible and how much are we sharing is popping up, not only now with Copilot. Copilot is only making it visible again, but a couple of years back, when they got the introduction of Delve, which I don't know whether everybody knows that one, but that kind of basically saw that same hype happening, that all of a sudden people were seeing things of data. With things, I mean basic data documents in the environment where they would mention, hey, I'm seeing this particular document. I don't think I should be seeing that document. Delve is causing this. No, it's actually not Delve. Delve is just making it visible again. Because actually the sharing, going back to that one particularly, was already there before Delve got introduced. And going one step back, the same happened when SharePoint Search got better. All of a sudden, people started seeing search results of things that they did not expect. Well, it's all the same happening over and over and over again. So it's kind of also probably the question, what's the next thing in a couple of years when this happens again, when we're kind of over the hype of the Gen AI? But yeah, it's still there. And that goes back to eventually, and I think a lot of people having these discussions, but it's about information governance. It's actually making sure you have the basics in place, your groundwork, and once you start working with content services, as it's been called nowadays. Back in the days, ECM, Enterprise Content Management, was one of the terminologies which are being used. And you basically have a document management system that goes back to, you need to make preparations for it. And once you put data in it, you want to make sure that that's one, being stored properly in the right buckets, containers, and going back, what defines in the right buckets goes back to, is it findable? Do I know what data is in there? What's the metadata around it? So what are the properties? And start managing your life cycle of your data, your documents, basically, as well. Because eventually it's about people create data, and that's the easy part, because that's what we're doing throughout the whole day. But then start managing from the creation moment all the way to the moment where we should probably start deleting the data. And that last bit is very scary, of course. So that's where the challenges start popping up. Yeah.
So how do you use kind of the Microsoft Purview suite, particularly on that kind of first, like, to protect that data, to ensure that it's not overshared?
So, well, there's bits and pieces to gain insight to what's being shared. There's a small part in, it's not actually in Purview, to be honest, but it's in SharePoint actually, which provides some level of detail on what are the sharing links which are out there. But probably what you'll find is that on GitHub, there's more and more detailed scripts which allow you to run to get more detailed information on all the different sharing links. The downside of one of the things which is there in SharePoint out of the box by Microsoft is that it's only limited time where you can actually see the shares happening. So going back to having insights in your whole environment, some customers of mine have millions of documents, terabytes, really terabytes of data. You don't get all that insight. So that's one thing which is really interesting, to just gain the insights. And then based on those insights is starting to use, Purview from a broader sense, but the bits and pieces which pop up most at the start when I'm starting to get into discussion with customers is, one, sensitivity labels, which is there in information protection. And secondly, data loss prevention. And the last, both of them basically help out with securing your data, but they both do it in different ways, of course. From that perspective, I think you've covered both topics already a couple of times. I'm assuming in previous episodes of the podcast. But just to make sure we're on the same page, the sensitivity labels allow you to put a label from a classification point of view, data classification point of view, public data, internal data, confidential data, secret data. Those could be 4 different levels. And that allows you to gain insight on, let's say if we have 9 million documents or 10 million documents, let's say that one, then it's probably easier to start explaining. From those 10 million documents, 1 million documents might be secret. So this is where the risk is. And eventually talking to a CISO, it's about actually the risk. Where is my data, which has confident information? That's where the risk is, and we want to mitigate that risk. And by providing the labels, you gain those insights. And secondly, what it allows you to do is then either put protection on the documents, which is then done by a label combined with Azure Information Protection, or you start using or combine it with data loss prevention, basically making sure that if somebody shares via email or via document share a document out there, which is then being tagged with the secret level, you might want to say, hey, that's not being allowed when you're sharing it out to your colleague. That's fine, but when you share it out to maybe somebody outside the company, that's something we want to either warn or potentially block, and that's where the steps of the security controls start popping in as well. So yeah, that's one of the things which you initially start off with most of the times.
So when you do work with a customer and they do have, terabytes worth of data and millions of files, and you've defined these 4 labels, now it's not pragmatic to get end users to go around and label millions of documents. So how do you go around when people have got obviously E5 compliance licensing we're talking about, and the world of auto classification? What would your tips be when people have got those licenses to start a project to automatically know your data and try and programmatically identify where your sensitive data is and what defines sensitive data?
So I did try that first approach, saying, hey, you got 10 million documents, you might want to do it manually, but they said, no, we're not going to do that. That probably makes sense, I guess. But besides that, yeah, that's where it gets interesting, because so the first step, this is what I tend to see. Let's take a step back. What I tend to see is data security projects take a long time. Some projects, what you can basically do is say, hey, we have a project, we want to start introducing M365 or Teams or particular ways of provisioning that basically has a start and an end, and you can put a particular time period on it, which is most of the times, well, depending on how big the project is, of course, but most of the times less than a year or something. With data security, it's really not about putting a particular time period on it and saying, hey, we want to do everything within half a year, because that gets really challenging. It's about a continuous journey from that perspective. And the journey is about maturing, basically, the data security of your company. So you start off with potentially the labels and introduce that perspective. And it's not about technically implementing the labels, because that's probably the easy part, let's put it that way. But it's really about the organization first, and what are the different classifications? How does a document end up with a particular classification? So how do you define your levels and what's in the level? So how do you make sure that it's really clear that internal and confidential is a different classification? But what's the difference, and why? When is the one or the other applicable to that particular document? So that's always a hard discussion. Hopefully, when the company has already made steps to it, they already know they have their policies in place, and you can use that as a starting point. Say, okay, maybe you have a BIF classification. That's the Dutch word for it. It's about availability, integrity, and confidentiality. Those are most of the times already in place as a policy within the company, and you can start using that particular one to kind of build upon. And then secondly, what's the next step is then really making the people, of course, aware, and start with manual labeling from basically explaining, hey, when you work on a document at the moment, apply the proper label. When you open up a document and there's no label, or on the other hand, you think the label is incorrect, make sure you have a process in place and that is top of mind, that you want to start updating those labels. So that helps out with newly created content, and well, let's point it out there as active content, which is actively being worked on. So that helps a small bit already. And that's where the journey basically starts, because going back, what we just said, maybe you have 10 millions of documents. So well, you're not going back manually saying, hey, I'm going to touch all the documents and update the classification. So this is where Purview provides the SITs, or the sensitive information types, or to be honest, actually a bunch of options which are out there. The sensitive information types is one of those. And that is kind of, I think it's around 300 plus at the moment.
36 is there?
Yeah, I should probably check how many there are, but there's a really large set of out-of-the-box by Microsoft created sensitive information types, which help you out basically detecting your data. That means is, for instance, an IBAN, if I probably pronounce it right, banking number, because that's probably something which we all know since you're based in the UK, in the Netherlands. But an IBAN is something you might want to detect in your environment, knowing that where there's an IBAN, it's actually interesting to find that in a document, and especially in the documents which are at rest from the perspective. And you can actually know that when there's one IBAN in there, you can potentially say, well, maybe that's not a big of a problem. But when you have an Excel list with multiple sets of data, so let's say company names, address information, together with IBANs and maybe some other confidential information, this is where these combinations basically start to become really interesting, and where you probably want to start taking your document from, well, but I'm not hoping that it's a public document, but at least starting it from potentially confidential or maybe even into the secret level. And this is how the system basically helps out with identifying where your, well, high risk, going back to that one, your high risk documents are, and those are the ones which you want to apply the security controls on top of. So that's the starting point from that perspective. And the other bits and pieces which might be interesting is going back to, well, information governance. So if it's not there, if you don't have the possibility to, because you're not going to tag all your high risk or your risk data, confidential data in your environment with the out-of-the-box ones, you can create your own, but that's probably challenging, because how do you figure out what's the particular use cases which are there and which, well, patterns from that perspective do you need to apply on it? There's other pieces which you can use, or going back to the information governance is, if that's in place, that really helps out, because with information governance, you might be able to say, hey, I know this particular team or this particular SharePoint site supports a business process. And if that's a primary process, which might be document driven, that's something which is probably belongs to the high risk. So this is where information governance, understanding of, well, maybe the thousands of sites or teams you have in your environment, understanding of the 1,000 that there are 200 maybe supporting a primary business process. Those are the ones which you want to start focusing on. And I wouldn't say forget, but put at a lower priority the other ones. And this is where information governance and data security kind of start together. And information governance provides the basics, the foundation to start applying data security.
Agreed. I think on the sensitive information type aspect, it surprises me how many customers I speak to who are aware you can create custom sensitive information types, but get them completely wrong. They'll have, just one primary element in there and have it set to high without realizing you have a high, medium, and low risk threshold, and then you have a primary and supporting elements that you can add into it. The more information you give it, of course, the more accurate you can actually make it be. But even the ones out of the box, they're great. I agree with you, Bram. I really do think that they're a good starting point, and I think I have to emphasize that they're a good starting point. But for me, I would like the opportunity to turn some of them off, some of them that are not relevant to you in your organization, because even through, Content Explorer, you get a lot of noise. And even the ones that you do create yourself, or even the ones that you choose to adopt, the ones that Microsoft have given you, even they take a lot of fine tuning. It's not just a one-time deployment, one-time fix. Have you both found that yourself?
Yeah, so where I've tried it out is, what you don't want to do is just go and switch it on and let it go and classify millions and millions of documents. Because if you've got it wrong, you've got a headache then of how you're going to reclassify them. So, as Bram said earlier, this is kind of not a quick fix. So where I've done it is where we've used third-party tools such as ShareGate to clone a SharePoint site, and then have that in like a test environment and try out those classifiers. Now you can go and try them out. So you can kind of run them in that like preview test mode before you switch it on. But at least then that allows you to try it out, make sure you're happy with the data set before you kind of switch it on. And I think the other thing that I found that people don't understand is those sensitive information types that Microsoft provide. You cannot edit them. However, many people don't know that you can clone them. So effectively, you can export out the XML and then you can bring them in and then you can adjust it. So, for example, like the credit card number, Ryan, where you were talking about the primary and secondary elements. Well, we know you've got a credit card number that can range between, I think, 13 and 19 characters. depending on the types of cards. We know whether it's a Visa or a MasterCard or an Amex, so you're looking at that as a secondary thing. You've normally got something to do with an expiration date and something to do with the CVV number on the back of the card. So it's looking for combinations of that. Well, if you're working in an environment where you only work with Amex cards, or there's some other things, you can take that out and then you can start saying, I'm looking for this additional information as well. You might want to say, well, I want to also be looking for their email address, or there should be some form of order number or something else. So you can make it personal, but you have to clone effectively one of the sensitive information types and then augment it with your own stuff. And that's where I find, having a cloned SharePoint site with a representative sample of the data you want to test, you can keep trying them out and fine tuning. Once you're happy with that, then you can deploy to production.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, it's interesting, those sensitive information types, because the bit on how do you know how accurate basically a sensitive information type is there's bits and pieces in there which are just kind of a really simple ones. So the accuracy is pretty low. But here in the Netherlands, we have a social identification number, which, for instance, has a particular validation in the back. There's a technical of mathematical check, basically, which is being done. So the interesting bit, luckily, what we have, or what Microsoft did, is they put in that as a particular function, as what's being referenced to. And there's some of the sensitive information types have functions in the background, basically meaning there's a mathematical calculation being done on the actual data it found to validate. That means so the social security number, for instance, is 9 numbers. So just 9 numbers. That doesn't say, for instance, that it's a social security number. But with the check, you kind of eliminate, there's a particular, the mathematical calculation. You can check whether that particular 9 digits is within the boundary and the other ones is outside of the boundary. And then with supporting elements, that's where the accuracy starts growing, and kind of, this one really is, or the chance that this is basically a correct one is pretty high from that perspective. That's also an interesting one, looking at, particularly here in the Netherlands, which adds a lot of value. And on the other end, going back to the three-on ones which are there in the environment, it's also got a lot of the stuff which is basically not applicable to the customer, potentially, especially when I'm dealing with Dutch customers. So, for instance, then the Australian bank number, that's less value. So this is where you can also start slimming down at least and making a kind of a short list to start off with. And let's see from the beginning, from a low maturity point of view, where you're starting off with data security, let's get those in and really validate then the outcome, which is another challenge, because then you really need to put in all the proper permissions in place, because who is the person who is actually allowed from that perspective to have a deep look into whether it's correct or not, because eventually you're going down all the way to the document and actually potentially open up the document or the email, which means you're going to look at sensitive information from someone. So, and this goes back to technical bits and pieces is one end of the solution, but you need to have in place all the internal organization, making sure that there's not, pretty limited set of people who is allowed to do that. Potentially you need to put in an NDA for those people to make sure that they don't misuse those information. And that's a lot of the other stuff which need to happen in a data security project in general. So technique is only actually, although it's a fun bit, it's a small bit, to be honest. Yeah. Is that the same things what you're experiencing as well? Because
yeah, for sure. And I think Copilot itself and the automation in the label really relies on the sensitive information type, or predominantly relies on the sensitive information type. And I see a lot of customers just rushing towards sits and just building sits out. So as I mentioned before, I even had one customer build them, not test them in line with the actual sit itself, and just wrap them into a DLP policy. And the noise in the background that they got was just a tsunami of just nothingness. So, understanding how to create the sit. I always test the sit as much as I possibly can in place without wrapping it into a label or a DLP policy. Try and test as many scenarios as I can out. Then I would create a DLP policy or an auto labeling policy, but I'd use a recommend, not the auto apply. And I just scope myself and a couple of other people into either the DLP policy or a labeling policy that's specific to me, maybe yourself, Bram, and maybe you, Nick, and we can test that between us. The amount of people that I see rush towards auto applying a label. I've told this story a few times, but there was a financial services customer that I worked with in APAC that built out a number of sensitive information types, tested them 1 or 2 times, and then wrapped them into an auto labeling policy where it applied the label. And they ended up applying the label wrongly to almost 150,000 items, which somebody had to then go back through with the ERP super user and undo every single item individually. It took them like 4 months to undo it. I'd never want anybody to be in that scenario. But I think just moving on slightly from sensitive information types and sticking with labeling, I see a lot of people just lazily labeling items now, or just creating labels to prevent Copilot access. And I think for me, I see the plausibility in it, but I definitely gives me a sense of foreboding, right? Where you're just creating labels to prevent Copilot access. And it's like, there are so many different options that you can do before you even get to that point. Your SharePoint permissions, having them accurately aligned, making sure you've got the right admins and owners on sites, and so on and so forth. Building out those maturity models at the application layer before you just go and throw a label at it. The label should always be there, and I understand what you're saying, Bram. I think that's definitely a plausibility to get to that point. But creating a label just so Copilot doesn't get access to something, I don't know. It doesn't sit with me. What about you two?
I think you're right. There's a number of levels, isn't there? The access permissions and the site permissions, and they're much easier to tackle. So it's going right back to the beginning with Bram, when you're talking about the length of the time of these projects. It takes time to find out that data at risk. The access controls and the permissions in your various workspaces, your teams and the sites is much easier to tackle. So all the time you're minimizing the risks of that.
Yeah, I think that definitely goes back to information governance. I think the challenge which is there is we're having this discussion for many years, and it seems companies have a hard time understanding why it needs to be there, why they need to put in effort because from their point of view, they think, well, we can just create a team and people can work. So why should I need to apply maybe templates for a team and templates from, going back to what I mentioned earlier, supporting a business process. So that means you can probably put into a template a preset of folders, maybe if that's being preferred, or preset of metadata, not only on the documents, but actually on the team itself as well. Understanding that the team belongs to a business process, and then putting in the proper security from that perspective. So who is then allowed to access that particular business process? But not only from the start, but also continuously keeping validating that what you've been configuring at the start, because it aligns with the business process, that it's being honored throughout its life cycle all the way to the end. That eventually what we're going to do is delete the team, or at least archive the team if it's not being needed. But the value of what it's providing to the company, that's still a hard one. And you see that conversation popping up now with Copilot and on other moments, that you see that's where the value or the investment basically is going to what helps out with why you're doing the investment, because now you know where you need to tackle it. Your security is in a proper place. That the shares are not being shared outside of that particular team because it's a business process, so you don't have guests into that team. All those steps, and that's where it gets you need to make the investment, but it's a hard discussion, especially when you're introducing just out of the box. And that goes back to maturity. I think there's a really nice article on M365 maturity on learn.microsoft.com as well, which kind of talks about the different levels and what you can do. And that definitely helps out to kind of set a roadmap from the perspective to a company saying, hey, it's not the means to get to the level 400, but at least you properly start at 100, and then let's see along the way where you want to bring it to. But it does help you out to get the proper information governance in place. And that helps out with, or at least data security is part of it, together with also retention, because that's a similar topic, of course. But kind of comes in.
Perfect. I think we're right on time there as well. So what a good place to end. Bram, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a great podcast.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. It was really nice.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, see you all next time. Thanks very much, Nikki. Cheers, Bram.
Bye.
Bye.